Welcome to the AI Talk Show, where we discuss the news, share insights, bring guests from the industry, take your questions, and involve you in the conversation. AI is having an impact on our businesses, our lives, everything around us. As leaders in the industry, it's our duty to jump in and be a part of the discussion. So let's get started with the conversation. I'm your host, Asha Saxena, CEO, Women Leaders in Data and AI. And in today's episode, we will be discussing an important topic, AI and regulation. We've been talking about regulation everywhere. The explosive use of AI, especially generative AI, it truly has brought excitement, but also fear among so many of us. The fear has started these discussions on how AI regulations are going to be mandated, how AI regulations will be designed, and how can we prevent a bad or harmful outcome. You probably remember in March, Elon Musk, Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple, Andrew Yang, and a group of AI experts raised the alarm. They spoke about the AI provides risk to the society, especially by OpenAI ChatGPT popularity. They spoke about calling the pause on all AI development. In May this year, an open letter was signed by AI executives, including the CEO of OpenAI and Google DeepMind. And it stated the mitigation, the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority, up there with fending off pandemic and nuclear war. Today, we will discuss what the challenges are to AI regulation and explore what some countries are doing to control AI technology and provide regulation. To discuss AI and regulation, we have with us today Alexandra Ross, a senior data protection use and ethics counsel at Autodesk and a WILDA member. Alexandra, welcome to the show, the AI Talk Show.
Thank you, Asha. I'm very happy to be here.
When we talk about regulation, Alexandra, you being a legal counsel, and especially in technology company, I know that this regulations is something which is on top of everybody's mind. Regulation, especially on AI, is right now a supreme challenge. When we talk about organizations like Google, OpenAI, really being concerned about what's happening in AI regulations, not just by the companies, but by also the government, is on top of everybody's mind. Former Google executive chairman and current AI evangelist Eric Schmidt had warned, there is no one in government who can get AI oversight right. And he spoke about the solution. He said, I'd rather have the current companies define reasonable boundaries, leave us alone strategy that has been championed by tech companies for last 20 years. The result of that strategy can cause harm. And we've seen that a lot of invasion of personal privacy or market concentration of user manipulation. I worry about how much can companies on their own really self-regulate. Implementation of meaningful guardrails could really be a challenge when tech companies are regulating, or even retail, right? This problem is not just for tech companies. AI is now being used for all industries. The challenge of regulating AI is real. And when I think about personally, Alexandra, when I've been working with technology for now 30 years, but what I see when I see AI It's really the velocity of development. Everybody is jumping in and trying to develop AI. It feels like there's a corporate race, right? I mean, if you remember when OpenAI launched ChatGPT, Microsoft goes ahead and invests $10 billion in ChatGPT or OpenAI. And then you hear Google launching Bard. It's, and then which country is investing the most? And this whole discussion about is China investing more than US? So the race is real. The question is, as we are running towards developing AI, and everybody, if you hear in the corporate world, anyone I talk to, everybody is talking about generative AI. But the question is the rules and enforcement of legal guardrails. AI is definitely rapidly developing technology, but regulation is a constant conversation and makes it difficult to, when companies are running to develop, it becomes really challenging whether these regulations can be implemented when these companies are such in a rush to development. You being legal counsel, being in data, and been really working with regulation, what are you seeing as a tech counsel, and especially working with AI? What are the outlines and the boundaries you are seeing within your organization? And what are your thoughts around, especially AI and regulations?
It's a good question. It's a very meaty topic, Asha. First, I just want to add a quick disclaimer that I'm here on the podcast today, and the opinions that I'm going to share are my own and not of my employer. But I'll talk a little bit about what companies like Autodesk are struggling with, and sort of the bounds of self-regulation versus some sort of federal or state regulation. Now, AI is the topic of the day. Everyone is talking about it. There's really positive outcomes that we can see from AI, but you touched on a few of the risks and the concerns that businesses and consumers and governments have. It's interesting because I do see that there's a bit of a power dynamic happening with a lot of countries who are rushing to sort of be the first to regulate, because that will sort of have the stake in the ground. And if the EU gets there first, or China gets there first, or the US gets there first, then everyone sort of models their legislation after that. So part of it is being the first. Part of it is having a space where you can promote innovation, as well as regulate some of the harms that could arise from AI technology, like privacy concerns, security concerns, bias, mis or disinformation. So I think there's a rush to get some of these regulations finalized because of ChatGPT and because the AI technology is accelerating sort of exponentially in the last several months. That's what we've been seeing in Europe, where the European AI Act was almost ready to launch in February of this year, and then when ChatGPT was launched, the regulators sort of went back to the drawing board and said, okay, we've got this risk-based approach where we're looking at prohibited practices, we're looking at some high-risk practices, and a framework and a methodology for companies to do impact assessments and have some sort of governance around AI. But what was missing was generative AI and the things like foundational models. So that's what's under discussion now. And what I'm reading is that there's a hope to have this legislation finalized by the end of this year. And then there'll be a grace period before that's enacted. But everyone, is anxiously awaiting to see what happens with the new AI regulations.
So you bring a really interesting point about private and public participation in really thinking about the AI regulation. And when we think about not only US, but really globally, countries and regions are thinking about this as a serious problem. I was in UK in June at the AI Summit, and I saw the government being extensively involved in having this conversation around AI. They're not only thinking about AI for regulation, but they're also thinking about how to educate their communities on how to participate in AI, which I thought was really forward thinking. The UK government is planning to become the world's AI referee, I feel. The government has announced £200 million AI strategy, which aims to truly make UK a global leader in the development and use of AI. And the strategy not only includes how to create an AI council, but also be responsible for setting standards and regulation to use AI in the UK. And what I really like is that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is really being engaged. And during the visit to Washington, he announced UK would be the host to the first global summit on AI regulation, which I really think is a positive move. And really, and the goal is that during that summit, they will be focusing on the AI regulation and leading and having this conversation, which is, I think, is a critical conversation. Also, the European Union, as a part of the digital strategy, is taking steps to regulate AI to promote the development and use of the innovative technology. So I do believe that not only US, but UK, EU, and countries like China are all getting involved in AI, how they're going to continuously innovate, but also regulate. On June 14th, 2023, members of EU Parliament adopted a EU Parliament Negotiating Act on AI Act. And I do believe that the Parliament truly wants to make the AI systems to be overseen by people rather than by machines to prevent harmful outcome. So truly they want to make sure that we are not jumping into the era. And the whole fear of artificial superintelligence where machines will get smarter than human and will start controlling. And I think that's where we are being cautious. On 60 Minutes, I think it was last week or a week before, where Sundar Pichai from Google said that the positive here is that before the technology has advanced, people are talking about regulating now. So the positive is a lot of people are engaged in this conversation. So before we talk about the EU AI Act, my question to you is, can you maybe talk about what you see as regulations around governing AI you have seen, and where do you think we are moving ahead? How do you feel about the EU Act and some of the key components that EU Act will cover that would impact businesses, even though we are here operating in US?
Yes, I can address that, Asha. So it's interesting because, there are current regulations that govern AI. So there are aspects of the GDPR, which has been in effect for over 4 years, that talk about transparency and automated decision making and having some sort of oversight around things that are close to AI. I think the sense is that the existing laws and regulations, whether it's anti-discrimination, product liability, GDPR, aren't sufficient to tackle what we're seeing with this new AI technology. Interestingly, in New York State, there was a new, you might have seen this, right? So that's close to where you're living. There's an AI regulation related to AI used in the employment context. So employers that are using AI technology in recruiting or promotion, sort of, the employee development, have to disclose that fact, and they have to do yearly audits to make sure that there's accountability and there isn't bias or discrimination. So that's one of the first things that we've seen enacted in the US. And then turning to Europe, it's interesting you were talking about the UK, because I think the UK is taking a more kind of progressive and liberal approach, on this sort of spectrum of how different countries, their approach to regulation. The UK is taking a bit of a light touch in terms of wanting to promote innovation and wanting to incentivize companies to be based in the UK, right? To have their offices in the UK and have their headquarters in the UK. Whereas we're seeing other countries like China, which is taking more of a state-based, kind of more controlling of how AI is used, and that's based on sort of their culture and their values, and a different type of government that's more in control of their citizens. Where in the US, we're kind of seeing something that might be in the middle, which is a little bit more progressive. And we've seen Senator Schumer propose, some AI regulation, and there's discussions in Congress right now about how we're going to regulate AI within the United States. Then we have Europe, which has, the new AI Act, which we spoke about a little bit, which is, taking a step towards regulation, but its intent is to regulate the AI uses, not the technology itself. And the scope of the AI Act is going to apply to providers of AI systems that are established in Europe or replacing systems in the EU market. So, even though we're talking about sectoral laws, these laws are going to affect global companies because their AI is going to be available to citizens in the UK or in China or in the EU. So we're going to have to make sure that we're aware of and tracking this new legislation and figuring out how we're going to comply, especially when there's potentially going to be differences in approach. We're going to see some similar foundational principles, but the devil is going to be in the details in terms of how AI is defined, how it's governed, how much oversight by the government we're seeing in the different countries. And it's going to be honestly challenging for companies to try to find a way programmatically to manage all the different regulations, just like we do now with privacy or security, where the GDPR might provide a baseline, but we see a lot of different approaches worldwide.
I think that's where the beauty is, that you take the regulation as the baseline, and then we have organizations who use that to, or customize it to how they can really stay in the boundaries, but also make sure that they can continue to be innovative and creative. So let's talk about the AI Act. AI Act text was nearing completion in February 2023, but regulators went back to the drawing board, and they tried considering the impact of generative AI, ChatGPT, and foundational models. The original text was focused on providers of AI technologies with foundational models. We have a situation where there could be multiple or versatile uses of model, which companies will build upon, and providers of AI technology are often removed from the development of the foundational model. Not full visibility. So the question is that as we are working with, or we are attempting to put some liability on the developers of the foundational models to foresee the risk of the potential use cases, what do you think, what is the status of AI Act right now, and what do we expect the final text to be agreed upon?
So on June 14th, the European Parliament adopted its position on the AI Act, meaning that this legislation sort of procedurally is now entering the final phase of adoption. It's called the trilogue, and that's when the European Parliament, the Council are, sort of in a room hashing all of this out, hashing out the final definitions and sort of where things are going to land in terms of a final compromise on the text. Interestingly, Spain has taken over the presidency. It's a rotating presidency of the Council. And Spain has really invested in AI over the past couple of years. And so there's a sense that, Spain really wants to push this to completion, and may or may not be more progressive because they may be more similar to the UK in their approach of sort of welcoming companies to be based in their country and looking at innovation. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of influence Spain has on these final negotiations. But there are a couple of things that we're still looking at in terms of still being discussed, and we're hoping, like I said, to see the final text by the end of this year. So the open issues are the definition of AI itself. So how AI is defined is going to be crucial, because you want to find that sweet spot of gathering what is truly artificial intelligence, and if we include these generative foundational models in generative AI, but there's a risk that the definition is either too narrow or too broad. So we're waiting to see how the definition shakes out and where the trilogue negotiations land in terms of AI definition. The other open issue is high risk classification. So the original text of the EU AI Act looked at prohibited practices, and then also a list of high-risk practices like biometric identification, management of critical infrastructure, education, things where there's sensitivity and companies really need to be addressing, taking an inventory, doing risk assessments, putting mitigations in place and having some sort of transparency obligations to what the AI technology is actually doing. But in these trilogue negotiations, there's going to be further discussion of like what is on the list and how that list can change over time, because there's a desire to have the legislation be future-proof and flexible enough so that if there's a list or if there's sort of categories that we can add or subtract things from those categories without, a lot of negotiation between the different bodies within the European government that need to address some of these things. What's on the list now? It's interesting because whether we talk about deep fake detection by law enforcement authorities, crime analytics, verification of travel documents, those have been removed, but some of the things that have been added more recently is critical digital infrastructure and life and health insurance. There's also talk about whether we include biometrics, recommendations of social media, systems that might influence electoral outcomes, AI used in dispute resolutions and border management. So all of these things that we're talking about, things that you're seeing in the news, all these concerns that we have about sort of AI going wrong, those may or may not end up in the list of high risk, which are going to be, more heavily regulated in terms of the governance and the transparency and the accountability. The other open issue is impact assessments. So similar to what we do now with privacy impact assessments, there are obligations related to conducting impact assessments of these high-risk AI systems, a fundamental rights assessment before the technology or tool is put into systems or put into service. So you would consider the intended use, the temporal scope, the country where the output produced by those systems is used. And, again, it'll be interesting to see how strict those impact assessments are and whether those impact assessments need to be produced to a regulator or made public, or how the accountability function of those impact assessments will result. But once we get the final text, once the trilogue negotiations have been completed, then the EU member states will have to designate competent authorities, including a national supervisory authority, to oversee the implement of the regulation in the various countries, France, Germany, etc. And it'll be interesting because I think, there's a discussion about, will it be the data protection authorities that step up and take on oversight of AI, or will there be separate designated offices that are just tasked with regulating AI? I think I'm partial to having the data protection authorities take on AI because I think there's a lot of synergies. Not all AI is going to impact personal data, but I do think there's an established data protection authority regulatory regime, and in some ways it makes sense to add AI onto that. But others may think that AI is so distinct and so technical that we really want to address it with a different type of agency or different type of office. So we'll see what happens in different countries. We'll see how it plays out in the US. Once we have AI regulation, if we have some sort of federal AI regulation, who's the enforcement body? Is it going to be the FTC? Is it going to be the attorney generals within the various states? How that's going to play out in terms of the enforcement of the regulation that is finally enacted.
I think it's a really interesting point. What you mentioned is the enforcement. I think that really makes it interesting how businesses are going to really implement it and where the regulation will lie around. What I right now we don't have enforcement of all these regulations right now on AI. And as you said, is it within the organizations? Is it data regulation? Is it AI regulation? Is it more business folks which are going to be getting involved? Right now, when the enforcement is not there, how do you see organization using the best practice, self-governance, which we are talking about earlier? How do organizations really take the step, and are there resources that they can tap into to make sure that they are regulating AI in the best possible way they can to benefit their consumers, their employees, their stakeholders?
Yes, I think there are a host of resources out there, whether it's the NIST standards. A lot of groups have popped up that are focused on ethical use of data and AI, and I think there's an obligation really for companies to be tracking this and thinking about what they can be doing now, even in the absence of some of these federal regulations in the U.S. or waiting for the AI Act to come into force. It's interesting because there has been discussion and proposals about having an AI code of conduct, which would come into place in the EU while we wait for the final AI Act to be implemented, because there's going to be, potentially a 2-year grace period between the final text of the EU AI Act being decided upon and then when it's implemented. So there's a concern that we need to accelerate something. So there's, businesses can self-regulate, they can look at different standards bodies, but whether we actually sign up to a code of conduct and what that looks like, I think is going to be really interesting, because there's this recognition that there's a sense of urgency that we actually need to do something now, and we can't wait. The regulatory process, takes a while to kind of go through all the different bodies, and rightly so, because we want to have the end result of regulation be well informed and well drafted and have expert input. But legislation takes a really long time. What companies can be doing now is looking at some of the principles, taking a look at this code of conduct, which is based on the AI Act. It's based on having a common approach to AI governance, copyright protection, transparency, addressing disinformation, promoting responsible use of AI technology. There's a draft text that's been proposed, and it will be presented at the G7 meeting in November, being discussed between US and EU representatives. So we may see an EU code of conduct for AI coming out fairly soon. And then companies will have to decide whether they're ready, to sign up to that AI code of conduct publicly, or whether that helps inform, how they're developing their programs. A lot of my peers that are at companies, doing similar things that I do at Autodesk, we're actively working on governance programs for AI, just like we do with privacy and security. And it's helpful to have data points and frameworks that are being proposed, that are being promulgated, so that we have a bit of a roadmap in terms of how we're developing our own governance programs, our own accountability, our policies and principles and so forth. A lot of companies have really taken some really wonderful steps in terms of being public about where they are with AI regulation. I would say, Microsoft, IBM, Salesforce have a lot of information that they've made public about their responsible AI principles and programs. So companies that are struggling or don't quite know where to start, I think looking at some of the trust programs from those companies are really helpful. Also, the NIST framework that I talked about, The IAPP, which is the International Association of Privacy Professionals, many of your listeners might be familiar with them. They've just announced a new AI governance kind of work stream, a portal and newsletter where they're sharing information about all the regulation to help us track what's happening. And they are going to offer an AI governance certification, which will be coming out later this year. So practitioners can study that body of knowledge, can get the training and certification, just like we have with other CIPP exams, which I think is a really wonderful resource to help up-level and educate, the professionals that are going to be developing these programs within different companies.
Just as I'm listening to you, it makes me smile and make me hopeful that not only we have government getting involved in creating these regulations, but there's also certifications and self-governing frameworks which organization can use. So this is all good news, because as the technology evolves, we are being proactive about creating the guardrails where we can really be protective about where AI can be useful and where AI can be harmful. And just for the viewers, as we think about ANI, the narrow intelligence, I think when we are talking about machine learning, people are not that worried about that. When we start talking about general intelligence, the artificial general intelligence, when machines start becoming intelligent, and then really the worry comes when it's artificial, when we get to the ASI, the super intelligence, when we feel that the machine is going to have consciousness and machine will start acting and creating by itself without any human intervention. And that's where we need to start creating the guardrails. There's a lot to track and get your arms around. Best practices, I would suggest, are to follow laws, understand the regulation, get involved, make sure that you are looking at the best practices around what industry associations are providing. And I think, Alexandra, you mentioned quite a few associations that our viewers can track. There's also privacy associations, as you mentioned. There are many outlets that are releasing information on a regular basis, and also engaging into articles, really understanding what your own company is providing through the governance and the best practices. Really getting engaged, I think, is really, really important. The fact that technology is here for us to evolve and innovate and be creative, it is really important for us to become responsible, not only in developing technology, using technology, but also as leaders in data and AI world, how we can make sure that we are engaging our stakeholders and educating them is critical. Alexandra, I want to thank you so very much for being here today, talking about such an important topic. Not only this topic is important to organizations, governments, but also to people who are going to be engaging with AI on personal level. So thank you so much for sharing your insights on this topic. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Asha.
And thank you for all of you for joining us today. We look forward to bringing you more thought-provoking discussions, cutting-edge news, and expert insights from the industry in our next episode. Please go to the LinkedIn to subscribe and follow, as well as check out all the links and resources in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others and leave a comment or question or review. That's all for this episode. I'm your host, Asha Saxena, and this is the AI Talk Show. See you next time.